one person that has this eureka moment, right? You know, working on a project, maybe they're working on some software, maybe they're working on a lab, and they just make a discovery. Thanks. And so then that person takes the steps to maybe become an entrepreneur. Well, very quickly, what happens is that that person has to begin to build a team because they can't do it all. And so once you start trying to bring other people in the team, that's where conflict happens. And so what we find is that, and you guys have heard the stat that 9 out of 10 businesses fail. Well, one of the reasons why we believe that there's a high rate of business failure is not because of the actual idea. The idea may be solid. There may be a market for the idea, but oftentimes it comes down to the team. The team just can't work effectively to bring that idea to market. So what I'm going to challenge you guys to do today is to think about your science as if it is a business. I want you to think about your science as if it is a business. And I want you to think about your teammates as the team that's going to be trying to bring that business to the marketplace. Because again, this is how I see translational science. To me, translational science is nothing more than the process of somebody having an idea and bringing it to the marketplace in the same way that a business owner would have to try to bring a product to the marketplace to scale it up, get funding for it, and to continue the operations of business. Okay? So this right here, you have these in your PowerPoint slides. This is what we call a business model canvas in the business literature. In psychological literature, we can look at this as a mental model. And this can be a tool, like I mentioned earlier, to begin to visualize the cognitions that you have in your head. So how many of you guys have ever seen a business plan? Anybody ever seen a business plan? Anybody heard of a business plan? All right, so we've all heard of a business plan. And oftentimes this could be a 30, 40, 50, 100-page document that a entrepreneurial team will develop oftentimes to try to get funding for their business. In a lot of ways, when I look at grant proposals, to me a grant proposal is very similar to a business plan. It kind of really lays out, the feasibility of, if we give you this money, how are we going to get a adequate return on this investment? That's the same thing that an entrepreneur does when they're trying to get funding for the business. And then a lot of entrepreneurs actually try to go and get federal funding through STTR grants or SBIR grants. So this is what we call a business model canvas that says, you know what, forget about the 100-page business plan. How can we whittle down the primary elements that underlie the feasibility of your particular idea and put it on one page? And so what I start to do now as I work with scientists is, how can we take the fundamentals of your work and put all of your work on one page? And now you can use this as a guide to when you're actually writing grant proposals or even when you're writing your papers for publication. Putting everything on one page is what we found is to be a very useful tool to organize not only your individual thoughts, but to also make sure that everybody on your team is on the same page. So if you want to see something interesting, oftentimes what I'll do is I'll sit down with the team. I'll give each one of the team members one of these what we call business model canvases, and I have them work independently to fill out the canvas. Then we'll have a poster size one of these canvases and we'll put it up on the wall. Now individually what we do is when they fill out these 9 boxes, they use sticky notes, and so they write down for each one of these 9 boxes what they think the elements are, put it on the individual, and then once we break and we come together as a group, they take all their sticky notes and start putting them up on the wall in the respective boxes. And guess what happens? What happens? Man, in red. What happens?
They have different ideas.
Yes, about the same work. Oftentimes they've been working together for years. When you ask them, like, so what is the actual problem that we're trying to solve? And people will have different ideas of what the problem is that they're trying to solve, or how it gets paid for, or what the expenses are, or who actually needs to be on the team, or what expertise is needed, those kind of things. And so what we find is that this can be a very enlightening and eye-opening exercise for those of us who are working together in teams. So we're going to go through each one of these boxes individually. Okay? This particular version, there are different versions of what we call the business model canvas. This particular version was developed by a company called Co-Starters that's up in Chattanooga, Tennessee. There's a local company called Rev Birmingham. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Rev Birmingham, but they're an economic development organization here in town, and they actually have these classes about how do we use this business model canvas in order to help entrepreneurs get from the startup stage into a growth stage. And so they work out of the social venture building over in the Woodlawn Foundation over in Woodlawn, and so they have ongoing classes on this. There are also other resources. You guys have these in your slides, but if you want more information on the business model canvas, particularly videos of how this thing actually operates, I've included some videos in your things. Also, I don't know if you guys have heard of the Innovation Corps, but it's a program by the NIH that has now started to take the principles of business and use it to more quickly, more efficiently scale up and spread science. And so the Innovation Corps uses this same process, this business modeling process, to take science and technology and take it up and scale it and spread it. All right, so the first box, if you pull out your slides, look at that customer box. So the customer box is on the far left. Now, what we call customers in the business field, you guys might want to refer to as, you know, who's going to be the recipient of care or treatment, who's going to be your research subjects, who are your sample or patient populations. These individuals are your customers. You are developing some type of product or some type of insight, treatment, or intervention for a particular population. What happens if you begin to look at those individuals as customers and start taking a much more customer-centric perspective? You know, what impact does that have on your science and on the way that your team approaches the way that you approach your work? Also, another type of customer is the funders, right? So if you need funding for your particular science, whether that's intramural funding, federal funding, or from philanthropic organizations, you are actually developing a product, and you actually have to try to sell and pitch that product to the funders through your grant proposals, right? And so what happens if you begin to look at your funders as a customer that, you know, has options? They could either, quote unquote, buy your product, or they cannot buy your product. And so how do you begin to tap into what they actually look for out of your product? That may give you a different approach to how you approach your science. Also, if your science is successful, you find some significant results, you want to publish that, you got to start thinking about your peer reviewers. So what are peer reviewers looking for from the outputs of your science? And again, we have to begin to think about that up front when we engage in our science. You have to think about what are the potential journal outlets we might send this to, what type of theoretical contribution are we making to the literature, and have that in mind when we're first sketching out our science. And then finally, our end users. So you got to think about, if I'm developing some type of intervention, something that's going to be at the point of care, how can we begin to take our physicians in mind and our other care providers that are going to be actual users of whatever it is that we're developing? So the next box is the problem. So for every customer, there's a problem. And if there's not a problem, if there's not a customer, you don't have science, you really don't have a business. Okay? So these are one of those things that, again, we take our entrepreneurs through. So when you think about the problem and you think about your patient as the customer, what are the types of conditions that your patient may have, or the diagnosis that you're working on? Some people said they're working on cancer treatments, others are working on, you know, other types of issues. What are the conditions and diagnoses that your science is attempting to address? What's the prevalence, severity, and frequency of those conditions and diagnoses? Okay, so that's much more of a patient-centered type of approach. But also you got to think about, okay, this is something that I'm delivering to make physicians' lives better. What is the problem they're experiencing? Is it some type of physician-patient interaction that we need an intervention to help patients understand the types of care that's being prescribed by the physicians? Is it that physicians don't have enough time to be able to effectively engage with patients, and so our science is trying to develop something that's going to make that better? You know, what is the actual problem that the physician is having? And so if we're working on science that's in a lab, to what extent are we actually including, you know, if it's a physician that's the customer, to what extent are we including that physician on the front end of the science? So, you know, as you mentioned, you're doing qualitative research and you're seeing patients, right? So you have a unique perspective because you see both sides of it and you can see across the translational spectrum, right? Don't you appreciate sometimes if you can have those conversations with the people who are doing the T0, T1 research to make their life better? Oftentimes when we think about the problem that our customers are having, it's useful to kind of put it in three categories. So what's the pain points that my customers have? And when I say pain, I'm not necessarily talking about physical pain, because if we're thinking about funders, peer reviewers, physicians, their pain points may be, I don't have enough time, I don't have enough literacy, I don't have enough money, I live in a rural area, it takes me an hour and a half to get to the local hospital. That can be a pain point for a potential customer. So to what extent are we actually honing in and identifying that, and could we put this on this one-page diagram to help us have a snapshot of what it is that we're working on? What are some of the gains that our customer wants? So it may not be a pain that they're looking at, but there's a desired gain. They want to get more out of whatever it is, and we're developing some type of product that's going to help them get more out of it. Or maybe it's they just need to get something done more effectively or more efficiently. So that's what we call jobs to be done. So that may be a useful way to categorize the types of problems that our customers have. And then finally, one of the most important parts, particularly when you start thinking about the eventual publications that are going to come out of your science, is what are the actual gaps in the theory, what are the gaps in the literature, and what are the gaps in the processes. Maybe there is a lack of best practices on how to engage in a certain treatment place. And so what our product is doing is trying to address those particular gaps. So to what extent are we very clear amongst the people within our team as to what the gaps are in theory as well as in practice? So the next thing is competition. So this is clear from a business standpoint. Oftentimes we don't as clearly recognize competition, in the academic science realm, but we do have competition. When you think about competition, competition could just be alternatives that your particular customer has for getting their needs met. So what are the current plans of care or treatment that your customer has existing, and how does that differ from what you're actually proposing? Because your science, oftentimes what we're doing in science is trying to come up with something that's both novel, creative, and useful, right? And so we're trying to come up with something that probably has never existed before, or we're trying to make an improvement on something that already exists. So what that suggests is that there's already a current plan of care or plan of treatment there. We want to make sure that we identify that as a competing alternative for our particular customer. Also, we want to understand to what extent is our current customer satisfied with what they have existing. Again, that could be from a patient satisfaction with care. It could be the funder's particular satisfaction with the amount of proposals that's coming to them. And then from an academic standpoint, what are some of the competing theories? Or you got to think about other research teams. If there's a particular call out there for a funding announcement, there are other teams that are probably just as smart, that are just as capable as your research team. To what extent are you aware of their capabilities, and are you trying to get a competitive edge over other competing research teams? So finally, this is not the end of the presentation, but when you start thinking about the solution, so we've identified who the customer is, what problem the customer has, how is the customer currently getting their need met, that's the competition. The next box is, okay, so what is our proposed solution? Okay, so are we proposing a new care plan, treatment, or intervention? Are we developing a new value proposition? So a value proposition is a synonym for our solution. Oftentimes we can think about this from a grant standpoint as your specific aims. So your specific aims could be listed under the particular solution box. Okay? This is essentially what we're actually developing. This is important. Okay, so if we are successful in developing our solution, once we kind of begin with the end in mind, what will be the actual benefit to our customer if we are successful in carrying out the science or carrying out whatever the team is working on? So again, going back to that notion of pains, gains, and jobs to be done, how is our particular solution going to help relieve the pains of our customer, create the gains that our customer desires, or helps them get jobs done more cheaply, more cost efficiently, or more effectively. And then, oftentimes, and I guess your papers are probably similar to ours, but we always want to make sure that we are explicit about the theoretical and practical contributions of our papers. So how do we go ahead and begin to kind of sketch out what our potential theoretical and practical contributions are for our science and putting that on our business model canvas? Let me stop right here. Can you see how the different members of your team may have different ideas about each one of these boxes? In any one of these boxes, if there are different ideas between your team members, that is a source of conflict. And that could be a reason why you're not getting your work done, getting your work out more quickly, why you're having tension in your team, in your teams right now. Some people are not getting their work done. They say they're going to get it to you by Tuesday at 5 o'clock, and now it's Friday at 10 o'clock, and you still haven't gotten it. It may be that they just have a misunderstanding of what it is that you guys are actually working on. This is why this is important. So the advantage. So in business, we always talk about what is our competitive advantage? What's going to set us apart from the competition? And so how many of you recognize that we are in an extremely competitive environment, particularly as it relates to getting grant funding, trying to get our papers published in the top tier journals? There's a lot of competition for those pages in JAMA, in New England Journal of Medicine, Journal of Applied Psychology. There's huge competition. I know in a lot of our journals, the acceptance rate is like 9% and less in a lot of our journals. And so they receive hundreds of submissions a year. So how do you gain some type of competitive advantage in order to make sure that your work is published, you get your work funded, or even you get people to enroll in your particular study? I was talking to somebody yesterday, and they were having a huge challenge in getting people just enrolled in the study. They have the money, they've designed the study, but it's just getting enrolled. So when we talk about advantage, again, we have to make sure that there's some type of novelty or there's some type of innovation as it relates to our projects. And particularly if you're going after grant funding, that's oftentimes one of the criteria for how your grants are being rated is the innovation part. So why should subjects enroll in your study? And then retention is also a big thing in some of you guys' studies. So how do we make sure that people stay enrolled in our studies? Why should your science be funded? Why should your science be published? And what are some of the other alternatives that your potential customer has? All right, so this is about the brand. So when you think about your team, does your team have an identity? Write that down. That's a good one. Does your team actually have an identity? Do we have a brand? What do we stand for? When you think about Coca-Cola, you think about McDonald's, you think about Nike. These are organizations that have a very well recognizable brand. When you think about your team or you think about your lab, do you guys have a brand? Because having that brand is going to help your team coalesce around that common goal and common vision that we suggested is a criteria for having an effective team. The other part of the message box is not only what's your brand, but also what is the message? What is the message that you are going to convey to potential research subjects to get them to actually enroll in your study and to stay enrolled in your study? What is the message that you're going to communicate to them? What's the message that you're communicating to your funders as well as to peer reviewers as it relates to your brand? How does your customer develop trust in you? Oftentimes people don't stay enrolled in the studies because maybe they have a lack of trust in the actual team that's carrying it out. Oftentimes when I'm reviewing papers, if I feel speed bumps in the intro, guys, you know what I mean by speed bumps? I'm reading the paper and it just doesn't follow, the type of cadence that I'm accustomed to seeing for this particular journal. Or maybe they put something out there but they didn't quite cite it right, they left out citations. Maybe there's even incidents of plagiarism. Whenever you have that instance, you are creating a lack of trust in that reviewer, and it's going to be very unlikely that you're going to get a favorable response from the review team. So how do you communicate that, hey, we are competent, we're capable, and we are trustworthy in your science? Not only do you have to have a brand and a message, but how do you actually get that message out? So what is the mechanisms through which you are going to communicate your science to your customers? So what is your enrollment plan? What is your recruitment plan, or what is your retention plan? And have you adequately kind of sketched that out in the beginning of your work? So the distribution kind of follows that whole message thing. Is how does your customer actually receive whatever it is that you're working on? So what is the point of care? Is the point of care in the community? Is it in the hospital? Is it in the lab? All of this kind of relates back to the research design. Are we doing community-based participatory research? And then after the science is done or throughout the process, how do we begin to disseminate, the outcomes and the results of our science? So again, particular journal outlets, maybe you're going to do white papers. How do you make sure that you're identifying outlets that people who are in practice can actually get it and actually put it into practice? And then finally, what is your plan for translation, particularly if you're working in the early phases of the translational continuum? How do you get your T0, T1 research all the way out to population health and global health? What's your implementation plan? So how do you scale this up? So we found something that's going to have some impact on human health. How do we scale this up on a national and global stage? That's a lot easier said than done. And then what's our commercialization plan? Oftentimes I talk with people who are particularly doing work like in rural Alabama in the Black Belt, and that work is funded by grant dollars. Well, if it's a 3-year grant and you've gone into the community, you develop these strong relationships with churches and neighborhood associations and so on and so forth, and you say, hey, we're here to help you. What happens when the grant runs out? So what's our plan to make sure that if we've identified something that's actually having a benefit to people and to communities, what's our plan to make sure that we can help sustain that? So oftentimes that's going to take the path of commercialization. So are there other ways that we can make this particular work sustainable? Even if it's something that we're doing within a hospital, you've gotten money to do a pilot grant, but how do you then, once you find that the pilot is successful, what's our plan for making sure that we can continue that research, particularly if it's going to have an impact on patient care, employee safety, and quality? And this is important, right? Revenue. So how do we actually fund our work? How do we cover salaries and things like that? Oftentimes, you guys are probably using federal grants. How many of you guys are funding your research through federal grants? Or are you pursuing federal grants? Foundations? How many of you guys are pursuing foundation money? I know a lot of you are probably saying all of the above, right? Anybody doing like fee for service? What about industry-sponsored research? Anybody looking at industry-sponsored research? And what intramural funding? Nobody's going after? That's a lot of money at UAB. Okay. So you want to identify also your startup needs. So your startup needs are those non-recurring costs. Oftentimes it's what you need to get off the ground. I know some of you, as you probably came into your early jobs or some of the jobs that you're looking to go into after you finish your programs, you may have startup funds to get you started to maybe help establish your lab. So how do you begin to think about what my startup needs are? Or if you're engaging on a new project with a new team, what are some of the things that you need to take into account just to get the project off the ground? What do we need in order to launch and sustain a pilot project so that we can demonstrate effectiveness to go after larger pots of money? So maybe that's lab space, maybe that's equipment, maybe you need incentives to recruit people into a study, maybe it's some type of technology that you need, maybe it's a website that, again, you want to be able to get your message out to the people who need to hear it most. Maybe you need funding for a website that you can continuously put out information to keep people's interest up. Now, startup needs are different from your ongoing costs. So your ongoing costs may be things like, the ongoing rental of a space. Maybe it's salary support. Maybe it's some ongoing supplies that are continuously being depleted on a regular basis. So how do you make sure that you're building those costs in up front? And so again, this is typically something that's up front when you're doing grant funding, but maybe some of you are not pursuing grant dollars, you're just actually engaging in the work. How do we make sure that we're amassing the capital resources that we need in order to keep the project going? And also, there are other things outside of just financial resources. What about your time? Oftentimes that's one of the things I struggle with is making sure that I count the cost of, okay, I'm taking on all these projects. When am I going to have the time to actually do them? Is this a project that's going to be 6 months, 9 months, 3 years? Is it just summer work? You really have to count the cost of your time and make sure that you're not biting off more than you can chew. And so including that in the cost, I found is going to be really, really important. And also, this is something that's kind of hard to quantify, but what about the emotional energy that it takes to engage in some of your work? I know a lot of you guys are dealing with, patients that are going through some very difficult types of conditions. So what is the emotional energy that it really takes in order to make sure that you can consistently perform at a very high level? How do you count that cost, and how do you make sure that you're doing things to reinvest in yourself in order for you to experience what we call emotional exhaustion and burnout? And so that's one of the things that I'm learning by working on the health side of campus is that emotional exhaustion, depression, burnout are huge issues in healthcare today. So how do we make sure that we're taking care of ourselves? And how do we make sure that we're explicit about the people who are in our team, making sure we're identifying, is somebody being emotionally depleted? Are we replenishing that person's emotional resources? Are we helping to energize them? Are we doing fun stuff, or every time we get together, it's just work, work, work? Do we ever get together and just go have a beer? Do we know the birthdays of people on our team and make sure we send them a birthday card or at least an email on their birthday? So simple things like that can really help make sure that your team is rejuvenated and they're motivated to perform at a high level. And also just counting out who are the other people that we need in order to carry out this work. So who's our biostatistician? Who is our community-based partner? Who's going to be writing the front end of the paper? Who's going to analyze the data? Who's going to send it off? All those things probably need to be addressed up front when we're doing our science. So that leads us back to the model. So if we had sticky notes and markers, and one day, I'm going to be putting on, sometimes I do put on these workshops, we have sticky notes and markers and that kind of stuff. But this is at the point where we will then take all the things that you did individually, put them on this one map, particularly if you have all your team members here, and then we will engage in a conversation about, okay, so why did you feel like our brand is this? I don't see us like that at all. And then we start having these productive conversations. Or, you said we're going to go after federal grants. What particular outlets are you thinking that we could go after? Because I'm really thinking that we can get some intramural funding. And so again, having these conversations at the beginning of your projects can really help the effectiveness of our team science. So I'm going to put a pin there and let's just start having a conversation. So any light bulbs go off for anybody in here? Does anybody recognize some opportunities when you go back to your team to say, hey, this is something that maybe we need to sit down and kind of talk about? And remember, I'm a professor, so I'll wait. Don't make me call on you.
Just a general question about the template. Is that something that's publicly available?
Yeah, so if you go to costarters.co, that's one of the links on, I think, on page 2. You can actually go there and download this. They have a Creative Commons license where you can use it for non-commercial purposes.
So,
yeah.
At the beginning of the talk, you spoke about the business incubator.
Yes.
So, when you are taking a concept to reality, so
yes.
Who funds? Where do you get the money to do all that?
We oftentimes talk about the 3 F's in funding: friends, family, and foolhardy investors. That's typically where funding comes from in the beginning. It's going to come from your personal savings, and you can ask your brother-in-law or your mom to tap into their 401k to come up with the money to get it started. Because oftentimes, you may be able to get some venture capital money down the road, but oftentimes funders want to know that you have some skin in the game. So they're going to want to know how much personal investment have you put into the project. So when you think about this for the teams that you guys work in, do you think this could be a useful exercise to have each one of you go through this? Yeah, maybe.
Well, I have a comment. So I work with 2 other doctoral students, myself, and program manager, and established investigator. And so even though, I feel like we could do this project, all of our ideas, could be great. She would take it, our established investigator would take into account, but she still had the last word. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like she still makes the final decision.
Sure.
So, it's like we can bring these ideas to her, but when it comes down to it, she determines everything.
Yeah, David and I and other people have had a lot of conversations around, so how do we make sure that we have buy-in from the senior investigators, whether it's mentoring or team science, particularly if you have somebody they've been successful for 20 years, 30 years, and now you're coming up with this new thing. It's like, I've been doing fine the way I've been doing it, so far. So that's one of those things where we're starting to try to do outreach and things like that. And, maybe one of those things where, with just you and your doctoral students, maybe you just want to collectively get together and just kind of walk through to make sure that you guys are on the same page. Oftentimes I found that this is just a way of being a good team member, is that if you can understand this for yourself, you can help kind of be a guide to everybody else on the team when you kind of think with this framework. Other thing is, I use this to teach not only my students here at UAB, but through the Birmingham Education Foundation, I'm also teaching high school students this, I'm teaching 8th graders this, I'm teaching 7th graders, how to actually use this as a method to just approach any type of decision or any type of problem. Because what we find is that any type of decision or problem is typically an entrepreneurial problem that typically has these same 9 or 10 elements. What are the costs? What are the expenses? What's the problem? What's the solution? What's the advantage? What's the benefit? What's the message? What's the distribution? This is the same type of cognitive processing that we do for anything, whether it's who to marry, what house to buy, if you're working on some type of nonprofit board or YP board or what have you, you're going through this process whether you know it or not. And so what we're doing is trying to help what we call externalize your cognition. And so once you practice this several times, now those things come to you very quickly. And so you're less likely to be blindsided about, wow, we didn't even think about X, whatever that X may be on this particular map. Questions?
Do you suggest that every person on the team should be fully aware of every single aspect of that?
Yes.
Because I'm just curious because we have, designated people who deal with the cost, designated people who deal with, problem and competition. But do you feel like we all should be aware of every aspect?
Yes, so even the people who are dealing with the cost, they may not need to be an expert in each one of these boxes, but just having this one-page diagram and maybe just have that one debriefing session where you make sure that everybody's on the same page, it may help them when they're doing their costs. Like, oh, okay, I get it, I see what you're doing. And it may impact the way that they actually do their work by understanding, the fundamentals of the actual project. And so that's another reason why we see errors in our work, whether it's medical errors or just other processing errors, is that people just don't understand the big picture of what we're working on. And that's the whole point about team science, is that oftentimes we go through very specialized training, right? I went through some very specialized training on social network theory, strategy, and entrepreneurship, but at the expense of all these other things that my team members bring to the table. And so oftentimes when we specialize, we necessarily have blinders on. And so we have this intentional ignorance, right? I have a depth of expertise in one area and very shallow expertise in a lot of other areas. And so what happens is that we will oftentimes make mistakes because we don't understand the big picture. All right.
Can I just interject maybe a question? So I think all of us are junior members of some teams, and some of us have had a chance to be leaders of teams too, but the challenge of how a junior member can help change the culture of a team is a pretty big one. And I guess I would just encourage people to have thought about the potential of this kind of approach. And I mean, as Dr. Hood has said, it's the most effective if you do all this planning at the start of a project, so that what we're trying to do is make sure that we avoid pitfalls and conflict and stuff down the road and dysfunction of our team. But recognize that if sometimes a dysfunctional experience is a real chance for transformation of your team, and you may find that your mentor who's always been doing it this way for 30 years is maybe more open to thinking about some new approaches to encouraging better communication when a problem comes up, and just to bear in mind that there are these tools, and that you may not feel like you're the person who can implement it for your team on your own, but that there are experts around who can be consultants who could help. Maybe I'm not trying to engage Dr. Hood's full effort for the next 5 years to deal with all these kind of problems, but if a major challenge comes up within your team, to let people know that you're aware that this kind of stuff happens all the time, and that there are people who can really help to try to bring order to a situation that's relative chaos at the moment.
Yeah, and a couple points to that. So in the literature, when we start looking at creativity and innovation comes at the intersection of different ideas, viewpoints, or opinions, different bits of knowledge. And so, earlier we talked about differences between task, relationship, and process conflict. What we find is that groups that do not have any task conflict have lower levels of creativity and innovation than teams that have at least some levels of task conflict, because you need that intellectual friction in order to challenge the status quo to come up with something that's both novel and useful. So another thing that we notice when we take people through, as a team, through this business modeling process, creative insights start coming up, because people say, hey, why did you think we should get revenue from here? Why did you think that the problem is this? We uncover ways that we never thought about before, and we challenge people's preconceived notions. So having some conflict really is good. I think the other thing that I want to mention is that the Pew Research Center acknowledged last year that there are now more millennials in our workforce than any other demographic group, more than Gen X and more than baby boomers. And millennials have a tendency to go rogue, right? Millennials tend to not want to work in the same place doing the same thing for 30 years as opposed to previous generations. And so I think millennials are going to be those that are going to be able to nudge some of our more senior scientists to do things in a different way. If not, they may miss out on a lot of really, our young, energetic talent. So I would say just own that process. Again, you still have to be aware of the politics, right? You got to be aware of the informal curriculum, as I understand it, right? As an informal curriculum, there's a pecking order, and you have to make sure that you play within the informal rules. But whenever you can engage in something that's going to either lower costs, bring in more grant dollars or bring in more publications, I think people are willing to honor that process. All right. So that's all I have. If you have any other questions, I'll hang around after it's over, and I would love to engage you after that. David, do you have anything else?
No, I think it's it's one of the things, I guess, that we talk a lot at the CTS about what team science really means, and what different people mean different things. And part of, I think, what the big concept of team science in large projects often means that there are people who aren't in the same physical location with each other who need to work together. And so, one of the things just I hope this discussion has made you aware of is that you need to have very specific plans to really optimize communication among groups of people who aren't rubbing elbows every day, and to keep people on the same track, and to help people take advantage of the new knowledge that's being gained as the project moves forward, and keep the program together. I don't know if Anthony has specific suggestions about ways to make this physically disparate groups more effective, and we have a lot of, I actually don't know if there are people outside of the room who are joining us today. We have a lot of technology to help people communicate over distance, but it's still a challenge.
Yeah, we're actually putting together a course in team science. And so one of the modules that we're looking at for that course is virtual teamwork. And so what are some of those tools that people have found to be very useful in facilitating virtual teamwork? So things like GoToMeeting, Dropbox, Evernote, how to use Google Hangouts, all these different virtual tools that are used how do we go through some training and make sure that people are aware of the resources that are here on campus. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Center for Teaching and Learning, but the Center for Teaching and Learning has some very good resources on how to engage in virtual communications and collaboration. So that's probably another one of those modules that hopefully we'll develop by the end of the year and start rolling out, or at least making people aware of the resources that are already existing here on campus. But increasingly what we're finding in the science of team science is that very few people publish single author publications anymore. That number has been going precipitously down. So most publications now are authored by 5 to 7 people, and most of those people are actually not at the same universities. And oftentimes they're in different countries and in different time zones. So that adds another layer of complexity on what's already a complex process of working collaboratively with another person. So again, that's one of those things that we want to make sure that people are aware of. So you have my contact information on the slides, on that first slide, my email address. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions. I've been going around to a lot of places on campus and giving these talks and doing workshops. So UAB Pediatrics and the Minority Health Center and Public Health. So if you guys ever want me to come over to maybe your group and maybe hold one of these workshops, I'd be happy to do so. Just reach out to me and let me know. All right, thank you.